Hi there, you're listening to the Estranged Heart podcast, and I'm your host, Kreed Revere. Welcome back to our returning listeners, and if this is your first time here, thank you for selecting this podcast to listen to. As we begin today's episode, I invite you to grab a cup of coffee or tea, settle in, and listen with an open heart. But first, the regular disclaimer. I am not a licensed therapist or counselor. Nothing within this podcast should be considered or taken as therapy. If you are in need of therapeutic support such as counseling, please seek out a therapist near you. Today's episode is part one of a two-part series, an interview with an estranged daughter who is estranged from her dad. And they've been estranged for just shy of a decade, and she is in her mid-30s, so with a child of her own. And I know that previous interviews that I've had with estranged adult children have typically been daughters estranged from their mom. So this was a little bit of a different story, and I want to give a little bit of a trigger warning with this part one and part two, in that there is domestic violence situations that are discussed in this, as well as alcoholism. So just forewarning you with that. And yes, so this is part one. Part two will air next week. And I hope that you are able to find some, if you're an estranged parent, some wisdom nuggets within her story. And if you are an estranged adult child, perhaps you'll resonate with her. And one of the things that really drew me to her story is that even though she is estranged and will likely remain that way, she does have compassion for her dad. And I know as an estranged parent, that's hard to understand. I'm hoping that her story will help you to understand how she got to where she is today. And that compassion is talked about more in part two. So that being said, if you are searching for estrangement support or reconciliation support in the form of either a support group or individual private one-on-one coaching, please feel free to reach out to me, theestrangedheart@gmail.com. And a new cohort of Zoom support groups will be starting again in September. If you'd like to get on the wait list for that, please let me know. Again, by email, or you can send me a message directly through the website, and that is theestrangedheart.com. So with that being said, on to part one of an interview with an estranged adult daughter. Hi, everyone. I have a guest with me today. Her name is Sarah, and she is an estranged adult child. And she is here to share her story about her estrangement from her father. I think what I'm going to do, Sarah, is just kind of allow you to kind of tell us your story. Tell us where things started with the relationship with your dad, and then what led from being in contact to not being in contact with him.
Yeah, thank you. I've not been in contact with him now he's not been in my life for a good 8 to 9 years.
Okay.
I've seen him and I've had small interactions with him throughout those 9 years, just because my sister still lives at his house. So unfortunately, there is every now and again, there's a moment where we cross paths. But for the most part, the last 8 to 9 years, it's been pretty much no contact. And, it's interesting because looking back at my childhood, in elementary school years, mainly, I didn't understand that my dynamic and the way I grew up wasn't normal. And I
Mm.
think that's pretty common when you're a
Mhm.
child. Your surroundings is your familiarity. And
Right.
so that was probably, though, the best memories I have with my dad was when I was younger, just because. So, a little bit of a backstory, which I can go more into. My dad is an alcoholic. And not only that, but he's very abusive in all the ways, um,
Okay.
verbally, emotionally, physically, etc. And I do think that the alcohol has played a role in where he is now and how it's led him to escalate his behavior. When I
Right.
was younger, I do believe that he was still an alcoholic, but it was more under wraps. He was still managing it okay. And so, but from what I remember, there was at least two to three times a year where he would just go off, you know, off his rocker, I guess. He'd just lose his
Mhm.
mind. And and it was always very scary. When I was younger, I didn't understand. I just know that he would get mad and he would yell, he'd scream, he'd just get scary. And I just remember not understanding what I think at the time it was more like what I did, even though looking back, it
Right.
wasn't me. But, it's so funny because it only happened a couple times a year. So for the most part, there was a stability of normalcy, I guess. Um,
Now,
but
where
it
was
wasn't.
mom in this? Was mom in the picture?
Yes, yes. So
Okay.
my parents were married, and my mom was, your typical like homemaker. So she was a
Okay.
house. She did work part time here and there, but for the most part, she was always there doing like all the housewife stuff. So making sure the
Okay.
house was homey and clean, and cooked the food and did the washes and the dishes, like all the things. Like, she just that was the role that, I know that she grew up very Christian. So for her, well, no, she didn't grow up Christian, but she found the Christian faith. And for her, it
Mhm.
was that, you know, um,
Right.
wifely duties and things like that. Um, but yeah, so she was there, you know, um, and I'm sure a lot of those arguments were more between my parents or my dad going off on her. But as a child, it felt very personal, and
Mhm.
I understand it. And it was funny because it wasn't until I was older, maybe like 12 or 13, that I started realizing how it wasn't normal for your dad to go on rampages. That's not normal. Oh, your dad doesn't do that? Really?
So would it be fair to say that your contact with other children who come from other family dynamics, again, as you just said, oh, that doesn't happen in your family? Oh, it happens in my family, right? So there's this conversation that generally happens as the kids get older, and that is where the recognition begins to come into like, okay, so this doesn't happen in other families. Is there something wrong with my family, or is there something wrong with these other people? Would that be kind of okay? All right.
Yeah. Yeah, it was like that. I think it was just I didn't there was no reason to talk about what was going on at home.
Mhm.
So I didn't. And which is interesting because I have a best friend who's still one of my closest friends now, who also kind of grew up occasionally seeing him go off, but she never said anything about how unnormal it was. And so it's just, but we were kids. So I think we just, oh, we just got to get out of the way. We just got to not be
Right.
seen or here. Um, but yeah, so there were multiple times growing up when I was a child where, I think I learned pretty early on too that if he was in a bad mood, it was like, oh, don't upset him, tiptoe
Mhm.
around him. I just started picking up on things, even though I don't think I knew it consciously. I
Mhm.
just, I knew it on a subconscious level of, oh, don't rock the boat,
Right.
tip. And so it wasn't until I was about 11 or 12, he ended up getting a DUI. And then because of the DUI, he ended up having to go to AA meetings and,
Mhm.
other things. But that was the first time. I'm sorry, I don't know if you can hear my cat.
That's okay. Mhm.
Okay. It's okay. Um, he's just a drama queen. Um, but anyways, yeah, it
So
was for the most part.
he went to AA and that type of thing.
Yeah. Um, yeah, so he went to AA, and then I remember that Father's Year was particularly um there was an extra remembrance to it because that was the first time that he admitted to us that he was an alcoholic.
Mm.
And in hindsight, this was a really big deal because for the next several years up till present time, he swears he's not.
Ah, interesting. Okay.
So something about the meeting or experience that he had made him feel called to tell us that he needed help. And I still remember giving him his Father's Day present, and he just started crying. And he said, I don't deserve this. I'm an alcoholic. I need help. And I still remember sitting on the playground and at 11 years old, and I was just trying to process that. Like, what does that mean? My dad's an alcoholic. And I think I remember a little kid came up and asked what was wrong with me, and I said, I don't know. My dad's an alcoholic. Like I didn't
Hmm.
know what to do with that information. Um, and and then things kind of went back to the norm, right, where things kind of even keeled out. But then again, there were these incidences continued. And unfortunately, from that time on, these blowouts just got worse. And as I moved into my teens, I started wishing my parents would divorce. I really didn't want him there anymore because at this point, I started understanding that this wasn't normal and I didn't
Right.
like how he was. And not only that, he was getting scarier. I remember there were many times when, and this is more like high school years, when after he'd have a big blowout, I would lay in bed and I'd be fearful that he would go and get a gun and kill us in our sleep, which
Mm.
sounds extreme, but that was a literal fear of mine.
So I want to
And
stop you right here for just a moment because I think it's I think it's important for the parents to understand the perspective of a child because we as adults we're going through the motions. Your mom was going through the motions of dealing with your dad and all the things that come with that. But we forget how disturbing it can be for a child, how unsafe they may feel, how fearful. I mean, it's even if you want your parents to divorce because you want some peace in the family and you want that part to go away, right? There's also a piece that's like sad. I just want dad to get it together. Like, what's the problem? Why can't he just get why can't he fix this? Right. And things seem to be so simplistic in the minds of a child and especially like we're talking about with fear, with being scared, right? A parent could say, oh, he would never have hurt her. But you as a child, you don't know that. You are feeling these things and emotions that are coming up within you every time he explodes and not knowing what's going to happen next. So I think that's talk a little bit about that.
yeah, that's a big one too, because, and my mom and I are very close, and thankfully she's they've been divorced now for over 10 years, I think even almost 15 now. And, um, it was hard for her, especially with her Christian background, to understand that she could leave and all of those things. But
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that, and again, I've done healing around this, but one of the things that was really difficult for me was a lot of the times when my mom would like defend me or my siblings when he would go off on us for no reason, it was behind closed doors. So
Mm,
as a child, there were many times where I felt like no one was defending me.
right,
No one was actually like saying in the moment, hey, stop that.
right.
There's one particular thing that comes to mind, and this was when I was a younger child, so I was probably like 11 or 12. My sister is 6 years younger than me, and she was having a really bad earache one night. I mean, she was just like in uncontrollable sobs because her ear hurt so
Mm,
bad. And so I remember I went and knocked at my parents' door, and I think my mom was in the bathroom, so she couldn't hear me. But the door was locked, and I was locking the door, and I was like, "Hey, Kira, my sister really needs you." And my dad's like, she's fine, go away. And so I went away and I went to go console her, and she was getting worse. I went back and knocked on the door, and he yelled at me to go away, that, she was fine and to stop. And, I went back to console my sister, and it just, she was getting worse. She wasn't getting better. So I finally went back and was like, you guys really need to come here and check on her. And so my mom came out at that point, was checking on her. And so and I had a friend sleeping over too. So there was no boundaries of when this sort of thing would take place. I was next to my mom. My friend was with me. My mom was consoling my sister. And my dad just tore into the room, grabbed me by the arm. And I still remember, like, my initial instinct was to grab my sister's daybed and hold on, because I was like, what's happening? And I remember he just like ripped me off at the daybed, dragged me down the hall, threw me into my room, and was just screaming at me about how I need to listen to him and how dare I not listen to him. And remember at that moment, I just felt so like, my mom was always very much like, that's not okay. And she'd tell me that too in another space. And then she told me later on that she would tell him in a different space that it wasn't okay. But in the actual moment, I felt there's a lot of like, there's this sense of like injustice, because I didn't do anything wrong. I was protecting my sister. Right. And then being, punished for that. And not just being yelled at, but physically like thrown around, like, very in a very unsafe condition of like, well, I don't understand. So, right. Things like that would happen here and there. And there were different things like that would occur, probably not like that was one of the bigger moments, but I think on a smaller scale that happened a lot more frequently.
Yeah. And that fear that comes up is very real. To a child, they don't have the ability to make reason out of things and understand that, you're likely to not be killed, but it can certainly feel that way to us when we're that little, that small. And then when there are other people around who are not standing up and saying, hold on a minute, stop doing what you're doing, right? Can then lead to, why am I not good enough for someone to protect? What's wrong with me? The children turn it around on themselves to what is wrong with me, that my mom hasn't come in here and stopped this, that no one has come in here to stop this. The neighbors haven't heard this to call the police to come in and stop this. No one. I'm here by myself as a child, dealing with this adult in adult form, maybe not emotionally, mentally, in the moment, right? But and to a child's mind, it's they can't make reason out of that. And then that sets up a foundation for a lifetime, unless we've done our healing work around that, for a lifetime of feeling inadequate, feeling like people can push and shove us around and it's okay because that's what was set up for us in childhood. Would that resonate on some level with you?
Yes, absolutely. And not only that, but when people did start to stand up for me in the future, I felt shame.
Yeah.
And that happened too. There was another event when I was in high school, and and it's so funny because some of these incidences get a little foggy. I can't remember the specifics, but I was in choir, and I don't know why, but whenever I would do like an event like choir, and it could have been just that my dad drank more before those events, but he always was in a bad mood. I don't really understand why, but like 9 times out of 10, he was in a bad mood, and he just kind of sit and glare at the back of the room. And I never understood that, because again, like, this was me expressing myself and doing something fun with my peers. And so this was a concert, and it was after the concert we were leaving, and I don't exactly remember what started it. I know that it had something to do with my then boyfriend and giving him a ride home. And I don't think my dad wanted to give him a ride home, but I think my mom or someone had already said they would give him a ride home. I couldn't tell you the specifics, but I remember he ended up yelling at me, and he dragged me around this corner of the school. And it was nighttime, by the way, because it was a night concert. He pulled me around. He was just screaming at me. And there was an adult class happening right across the way. And people came out because they heard him. And then he started saying, oh, look at this, everybody. Look, it's, said my full name. It's Sarah, my maiden name, and Sarah, and look at her, look at her, look what she's doing right now. And totally
Oh
like
my goodness.
humiliated me on top of already being humiliated there coming out. And
Right.
then I did have one of my choir peers, one of their parents actually stepped in, and they actually came up and said, hey, is there a problem here? And and my dad said, oh no, there's not a problem, it's just me disciplining my kid. And he's like, well,
Mm,
I like the way you're talking to her. And so I mean, there was a small part of me that was like, thank you.
right.
And there's another part of me that was like, oh my God, this is just mortifying that
Right.
my
Right.
choir peers are witnessing this.
Yeah.
And and he's presenting it in a way of it's me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I was just beside myself. I mean, I was sobbing, I was trying to control myself, and I was mortified and humiliated and all the things. And then I think those parents must have told a security guard what was going on, because the security guard started following us as we were walking back to our car. So it was me, my then boyfriend, and my dad, and the security guard. And the rest of my family was at the car.
Mm-hmm.
And so at first, my dad's being super rude to this guy, and he's really making it obvious that he's the problem. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting is, and this is a theme that I've seen with my dad over and over, which is just frustrating, but he seems to have like that silver tongue thing going for him, where he
Mm-hmm.
can talk his way out of anything. And
Right.
so I really thought, okay, this is finally something's going to be done. I felt there was a safety with security guard being there. And I thought
Mm-hmm.
maybe someone was going to have my back and it was going to be okay. And then after the security guard talked to my dad for a minute, me and my then boyfriend got in the car and we're sitting back there and I'm calming down. And the security guard came up to me. He's like, well, look, I talked to your dad, and honestly, it just sounds like you're a spoiled brat who needs to get yourself together
Oh my
or something.
goodness.
And it may not have been a spoiled brat. It may have been like a spoiled kid, but it was something along those lines. And I just immediately felt like, oh my God, okay, never mind. Maybe it is me, you know?
Right.
Um, and unfortunately, there's like so many times like this where other people, it's I mean, sometimes it was family, because unfortunately he has a very enabling family, which I know has not aided him in his illness.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but many strangers and even police officers would end up siding with him down the
Right.
future and down the line. And so there was always this sense of injustice constantly around him. And then in the midst of all of that, there was also this little girl who was in me, who was just dying to have a healthy relationship with her dad.
Mm.
In the midst of all the injustices and all the things that were never okay, that I should never have had to deal with. So it's imagine, especially being in your teenage years when you're going through all your hormonal growth and everything. I had a lot of anger and um feelings of injustice, really just hating him, and then also having these feelings of, but he's my dad,
Right.
and maybe he'll get better, and maybe we can have a good relationship. And back then it was still believable that we could.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That's that plays into, I think, the reasons why it's difficult for a child to estrange from their parent, because they're simultaneously going through these feelings of, I can't live like this anymore. This is terrible. I don't want to feel this way, those types of things. And but he's my dad. I really want a relationship with my dad. Maybe he can get better. Maybe he can get well. Maybe if I try one more time, he will see how this has been affecting me and he will be inspired to change. That's seems to be a common theme with adult children, would you say?
Oh yes, because he wasn't like that all the time.
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Right.
it did escalate in my teen years through adulthood. It did get worse and it did become much more often. But in between that, he was fine. And like one of the things that he and I had in common was our creative side. He was a writer. Well, not like a professional writer, but he liked to write stories and
Mm-hmm.
like poems and things like that. And so did I. So I
Mm-hmm.
remember I was always trying to seek that connection with him through my writing, which is interesting because as I became older, I haven't really written as much. And it's like, in hindsight, I think that writing was my way of trying to connect with him.
Yeah.
Um, because it was that thing that we shared, or we would play like Boggle together because it's like a word thing, and
Mm-hmm.
he liked to draw and I like to draw. So there was, I was always trying to find these connections with him. Um, and which makes it so hard too, because especially seeing him now with the alcoholism, it's totally taken over his life. He's not who he was, because he used to be very intelligent, very good with words. I mean, I think he still is now, but it's just disintegrating, and not that I don't, again, I don't want a relationship with him now anyway, but I see how he is now versus how he was. Like then, if he had really gotten help, he had so much in him. Like he had a lot of things he could have creatively put out in the world, but
Right. Let
unfortunately.
me ask you something, Sarah, real quick. Do you know anything about your father's history? Do you know what his family life was like by chance?
I know a little bit. Um, I know that he was what was called a latchkey kid because both of his parents worked.
Hmm.
He was the middle child, something else that he and I have in common. Um, and from what I understood, one of my theories actually, and I don't know how right or wrong I am about this, but um, he was diagnosed with ADHD, and this was back
As
in
an
the day.
adult or as a
No,
child?
as a
Okay.
child.
Okay.
And I do remember at one point him talking about how they gave him medication and he just felt like a robot. He didn't like it.
Mhm.
And they probably put him in therapy at that time too. And he really has a deep animosity for therapy and medication. And I
Mhm.
think that was his experience with it. Um, and then, and I do remember vaguely hearing that he had some anger issues, which continued into adulthood. My sister also had some major, major, major anger issues, and she's, outgrown it and everything else. And, I know she wouldn't mind me sharing that because it's important. But she, I think, was also ADHD and ODD, which I think is what my dad was. My dad, they tried to give him help, but it was back in the day where it was a one size fits all kind of help,
Right.
not
Right.
not catered individually. My sister didn't get help because my dad was like, no, we're not doing therapy. We're not doing that. He didn't
Mm-hmm.
get any help. And so I think that's part of the reason why her ODD lasted as long as it did. Then my daughter actually had it as well and would have these massive tantrums. But the difference was I got her help.
Right.
She was diagnosed with ADHD and ODD, and I was like, okay, we're going to figure this out, because I grew up with my sister, and I'm like, I'm not raising
Right.
a child. Like, I'm not doing that.
Mm-hmm.
She's thriving now. So in hindsight, I do feel like my dad had mental issues that he didn't get help for. And
Mm-hmm.
I think also back then, you were very much your behavior. There was
Mm-hmm.
no separation between your behavior and your identity. It was
Correct.
one and the
Yeah.
same.
Yeah.
Versus now, like when my daughter will have a meltdown or something, and we talk about it, she's like, I'm such a bad kid. And I'll say, no, you're not a bad kid. Your behavior wasn't so good. We got to work on that
Right.
behavior. You are not a bad kid. And then we go through affirmations, and I talk her up about who she is, her identity, and all the
Mm-hmm.
positive things she is. But back then, I know that it was very much internalized. Like, you're the problem. Your
Yep.
behavior is the same thing as you. So I'm sure that played a big role into it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I think it's important to our histories might, our past is living in our present in some form or fashion, always. And so I think it's always important to try to have an understanding, if we can, of where it's not an excuse, but an understanding so that we can then make decisions based off of understanding versus retaliation and hatred and all of those things. So
Yeah.
that's where I wanted to come from. And if you don't mind me just asking so that the audience has an awareness around, um, you don't have to give specifically, but about how old you are and about how old your father is.
Sure. So I'm almost 35,
Okay.
not too long from now, and he's going to be 64, I believe, in August. So he's 63 now, going on 64.
Okay. And this has been so the estrangement initially occurred in your mid 20s, mid
Yes.
to late 20s.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you. Okay. If you want to pick back up with your story. So I'm sorry I interrupted you with that.
Oh no, no, that's fine. I'm actually glad that you did because I mean that has probably been one of my biggest struggles is finding that compassion. And I
Mm,
have moments where I'm able to see it. And I'm like, he had a really hard upbringing. And not only that, so I don't know this officially, but unofficially, I am 99% positive he's a narcissist and has a narcissistic personality disorder. And I do believe that that came from him being told that he was bad over and over from his behavior, from not getting help. And he internalized it. And what does a narcissist do? They can't touch the things that hurt them the most. So they have to be perfect. They have to be the best. And if they're not the best, then they have to acknowledge that they're not perfect. And
right.
so I think that upbringing did really foster this narcissistic personality because he's very much doesn't ever take responsibility, doesn't ever, his sorries are always very empty. And it's rare that he even says sorry, but when he does say sorry, it doesn't matter. He does it again. There's no intent to really change it.
So it's
It's everyone
basically
else's
lip
fault.
service versus changed behaviors.
Yes. And it's always everyone else's fault. Everyone else is always to blame. A good example of that is he's told me before that I'm his most dangerous child. And he's told me this because into my later teens, when his behavior would get worse, I was the one that would start calling the police on him,
Mm,
one that made that initiative. And and I know a lot of my family didn't agree with that decision. They all thought I was overreacting, but I know I wasn't. I mean, he there was a couple times he laid hands on my mom. There were holes in the walls. He'd get this close to my face and scream at the top of his lungs
mm, yeah.
and
It's
punch a
not
hole next to my head.
right.
Behaviors that it's like I actually, as an example of not always getting help from authoritative figures. The first time I called the police, he was grabbing my mom and twisting because she was trying to call the police herself. And I remember he was like twisting her head and pulling the phone out of her hand. And I didn't stick around to see what else happened. I ran to the neighbors, banged
Mhm.
on their door, and just freaking out, telling them they have to call the police. And then I ran back to make sure my mom was okay. When the police came, there's usually the good cop, bad cop thing. For
Mhm.
some reason, my dad got the good cop and my mom got the bad cop.
Ah, yeah.
And he basically scared my mom and told her that if she calls the police next time, someone has to go to jail and don't waste their time, basically.
Oh my
And
gosh.
I thankfully a future boyfriend after that had a best friend whose mom was a police officer. And I summer after one of his big outbursts, that boyfriend took me to his best friend's house, introduced me to his best friend's mom, and said, "She's a cop. Ask her whatever you need to ask." And that was one of the best things that he could have done
Right.
for me because his this woman basically told me, she's like, "No, you don't have to wait to be hurt to call the police. That's one.
Yep.
Their job is to keep the peace. So don't let them ever scare you into not calling if you feel threatened or scared. That's all you need. You just need to feel threatened or scared. And you have every right to call. And it doesn't mean someone's going to jail, like that one cop says. It just
Right.
means that someone's going to come and break it up
Yeah.
and make sure you're safe." And so after I got that confirmation, I was the one that would call when he would lose his temper. So that's one of the reasons he said I was his most dangerous child. And second, he blames me for the end of his marriage,
Mm,
even though it was not me.
right.
I was the bridge, I guess, to information that ended his marriage, but I was not the cause. And I again in my teens, I was tired of him. I mean, he ruined family vacations. I think that was one of the last times that I was just like, he ruined our family vacation. And it was just, I mean, he hurt my mom. He hit her right in front of us. I mean,
Mhm.
it
Yeah.
was bad. And I remember, so it was probably a couple of years after that, but I knew that there was a way I think it was like save my mom and save me too. Cause I lived with my parents and I
Mhm.
was like 18 at this point, maybe 19, but I still lived at my parents' house. And I just knew he was having an affair. And there are some things my sister had overheard and seen that made her think the same thing. Um, and so I thought I went through his email and I found emails in his trash that were he'd had a 10-year affair with another woman, and or no 7-year affair, but it was a long-term affair. And
Right.
I'm giving it to my mom, and I remember it was so, at the moment I gave it to her, there was this huge sense of conviction, like finally,
Mm-hmm.
And I still remember when I gave it to my mom and I saw her face fell. I just was like, oh my God, what did I do?
Yeah. Again, those emotions of, oh, finally we're gonna do something about this. And then you see the hurt from mom. And it's like, oh my gosh, now what? Right? Kind of thing. So yeah, and this is what kids go through. This is what we go through in trying to make sense of a situation that there is no sense to be made from, right? Kind of thing. So this brings this episode to a close. I hope that this time together was time you feel well spent and that you are able to find some takeaway nuggets to help you on your journey, wherever you may be on your estrangement and reconciliation path. If you feel you've received something helpful or positive from this podcast, please consider following us, sharing this podcast with others, leaving a positive review, perhaps entertaining becoming a guest on our show, or following us on social media on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok under the same name, The Estranged Heart. As a reminder, there is an online support group on Facebook. If you are a estranged mom who identifies as being spiritual and approaches estrangement with a sense of curiosity rather than blame and judgment, and desire to do inner self-work and reflection, please seek us out. We can be found at facebook.com/estranged mothers support group. And lastly, if you are an estranged parent or an estranged adult child and would like to have your story shared on the podcast, anonymously or not, please reach out to me via email at theestrangedheart@gmail.com.